Since tonight's Halloween, I couldn't help but remember what happened a few years ago on Halloween. Though I'm not a firm believer in supernatural things, it's events like this that makes me look back and question, up until this point in my life, what I've thought to be true and what I believed to be false. This happened 4 years ago on Halloween. I was sitting on the sofa in my apartment, relaxing with my laptop, waiting for kids to come knock on my door as I usually did, being too old to trick-or-treat, but not a fan of parties. However, this year I just moved into a new apartment, which was further away from the larger homes I lived near before, and fewer kids seemed to be in the area. One of the reasons was that it was an apartment complex for single guys, and was far enough from my college that people who lived here had to drive to school. Still, I had a small bucket of candy prepared, as usual, which I'd been snacking from. The apartments on both sides of me are usually quiet. Nobody lives in the apartment above mine. So far the evening was just hours of silence and occasionally music from my laptop. It was almost 7 and still not a single person had come by for candy. I suddenly realized that I might have left the outside light off. I wasn't used to my apartment yet, so I opened the door and looked outside to check. It was off. No wonder nobody had come by. I flipped the switch on and looked back outside to see if people were there. I couldn't see anyone walking around, but it was dark and the complex was large, so I didn't think much of it. I closed the door and started walking back to the sofa. That was fast, I thought. I walked back to the sofa, stopped the music playing on my laptop and picked up the bowl of candy, then walked back and opened the door. A young, dark-skinned boy, probably around 10 years old, stood there by himself, with what looked like white flour sprinkled all over the top of his head. He was wearing a SpongeBob shirt, I remember, and didn't seem to be in a costume, nor dressed unusually, except for the white flour in his short hair and on his forehead. He didn't say trick or treat, but he looked up at me and seemed irritated for some reason. "Can I use your bathroom?" His voice was monotone, almost like he was trying to fake a robot voice. I smiled, a bit shocked that my first visitor was this kid, and he didn't even want any candy. "Sure, but be quick." He ran inside past me and closed the bathroom door, locking it behind him. I decided to keep the front door open and stand next to it while I waited for him to finish, holding the bowl of candy while looking to see if anyone else was coming toward my apartment. 10 minutes later and nobody had come by, and the boy was still in my bathroom. "Are you okay?" There wasn't an answer, but I could hear him walking around behind the door. The water faucet turned on a tiny bit. It was just streaming softly. I waited by the door. 2 minutes later and the water was still running. My front door was open and it was dark outside except for the glow from my porch light. Can you come out for a second?" Started worrying if the boy was alright, or if he was playing some kind of prank. After all, it was Halloween. "I'm opening the door." I knew it was locked, but I tried wiggling the handle to see if maybe it would budge. The water was running, but I couldn't hear anything else from behind the door. "Can you open the door? I need to use the bathroom," I said, using that as an excuse. I was starting to panic a little inside. Maybe he was hurt. No answer. Now I'm worrying. I ran my shoulder into the door once, wondering if what I see people do in crime dramas really works or not. It really hurt. I tried it again and again and again. I tried kicking the door. At this point I'm freaking out. The bathroom didn't have a key, so there was no way to open it. "I'm calling the police." Actually, I was worried if the police would even show up in a reasonable amount of time on Halloween. I called them anyway, and they said they were in the neighborhood and could be right over. While they drove over, I explained on the phone what was going on. When they arrived, I ran outside and unlocked the complex gate, then followed them back into my apartment. The 2 officers arrived, heard the water running and started kicking at the door. One of them had a crowbar, but they didn't need to use it. My cheap wooden bathroom door was open in a few solid kicks. It shot open, spraying paint dust and wood chips everywhere. The first thing I saw when the door opened was the water faucet still running. Then I saw both of the officers pull out their radios at the same time and enter the bathroom. I ran up behind them to see what had happened, but the officers' figures were blocking the view. "Oh boy," I heard one of them say. Now I was freaked out. I couldn't talk. I was already uncomfortable in my new apartment. I didn't want to have a memory of finding a dead boy in my bathroom. Both officers were shuffling around in the bathroom, then they stepped out and put their radios away. They just looked at me sternly, and then one of them sighed. I'm not sure what to say. I'm going to let you off with a warning, because it's Halloween. My mind was filled with nothing but confusion and fear. I couldn't even look back at the officer after seeing their expressions. I'll have one of our guys call you tomorrow to discuss this. For now, don't be calling us up anymore tonight. They walked out the front door and one of them turned back to look at me and left the door open. In my panic, I ran into the bathroom. The floor was covered with tiny white wood chips from the door. The faucet was off. I didn't even realize the officers had turned it off. Nothing was there and nothing else was touched. The next morning I got a call from a woman. I was certain when I answered the phone I was going to be in trouble, but what followed shocked me.
I was going to call you in regards to the prank phone calling this morning, but after reading the report the police gave me, I'm not too surprised this happened in the first place. This is the apartment manager, by the way. We had the same call from someone in that apartment 5 years ago for a similar thing. Maybe you can ask the police about more details, but simply put, when we used to be family housing, a boy died in that bathroom 7 years ago. They say he drowned in the bathtub. Happened 7 years ago, and after they left, the next residents called the police a couple years later, saying they heard a boy locked in their bathroom and wanted us to come up. When we got there, it was empty. I'm not saying anything. I don't know about all that. I'm just saying it's not the first time. But the whole bathroom's been remodeled completely since then. It was a long time ago. Just don't let any more kids use it, okay?
Was what I heard. I couldn't say anything. So it was a ghost. That's all I could ask. The call continued and we talked about some other things, mostly unrelated to the event of the previous night. I hung up and was feeling a bit shaken. Nothing else happened that day. I decided I'd better call someone to fix the door. The apartment manager told me that she'd pay for it, then jokingly told me not to let any more kids use it. I tried as hard as I could to smile over the phone. The next day the repair company came by. They called me on my cell phone and I jogged outside to let them in. Right then, it felt like my insides were hit with a rock. I suddenly remembered that my apartment complex had a gate. Nobody without a key could enter. No wonder there were no people trick-or-treating at my apartment. It was a singles apartment. No kids lived there. And no kids could have entered. Halloween as a concept is not particularly new. In fact, it's very, very old. It is also not a distinctly Western holiday. I mean, yes, Halloween as we know it, with the candy, dressing up and carving pumpkins. Those are all pretty much exclusively European. The idea behind Halloween, though, is fairly ubiquitous. Plenty of cultures celebrate a time of year when our world and the spirit world draw closer together. Most places view this one of two ways. Either it's a time when loved ones and long-lost family members can come back to us, like Day of the Dead. Or it's a time when we put up a bunch of protective rituals to keep away the things that go bump in the night. Halloween falls into the second category, which is why we wear masks and make jack-o'-lanterns to keep the malevolent spirits away. I can tell you without hesitation that both interpretations are correct. The story I'm about to tell you took place when I was just a teenager. I was living with my family. It was me, my two parents, my older brother and sister, and my grandmother. I had a younger sister too, but she and my grandfather both died in a car accident several years earlier. We moved houses not long after. Our new house was much bigger. I think having a smaller, cozier house would have let us feel their absence too easily. In a large home, we could just dismiss their absence as being in another room, even if we knew they weren't. Anyway, one Halloween our whole family, minus Grandma, was gathered into the living room where we had lit a fire and put on a movie for the evening. It was late and the trick-or-treaters were starting to thin out. The movie was in a bit of a lull, when there came a shriek from upstairs. Instantly, we all knew it was Grandma who had screamed, so we all ran up in a panic. As we climbed the stairs, we could hear her sobbing and saying, "It's you." It's really, really you." She kept repeating that in a kind of a hoarse cry as we made our way to her room. When we got there, she had fallen down onto the floor with her back against the wall, and she looked paler than any of us had ever seen her. Tears streaked her face and her breath was ragged, but her expression was a mixture of bliss and excitement. Standing across the room, dressed in an old-fashioned suit and with a hand in his hands in front of him, stood my grandfather. I'm sure I don't have to tell you how stunned we all were. None of us were particularly superstitious, and even if we were, that's just not the sort of thing you'd ever expect to come across. Had I known then what I know now, I would have ordered him, out of our house that very minute. But I didn't. My mom was the first one to break down. Seeing her father again brought her to tears immediately. But my grandfather simply smiled and reassured her. We spoke for what felt like hours, hearing the story of how Grandma was in her room, getting ready for bed when she heard a tapping on the window. When she turned, she saw his face there peeking in at her. She explained that this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. When you lose someone you love, you see them everywhere. But when he didn't leave and motioned for her to open the window, then climbed inside once she had, Grandma knew it wasn't the same. That was when she screamed and we came in. After that, my grandfather regaled us with tales of the other side. How beautiful it is and how all your wildest dreams can't compare to the reality of it. I'd like to tell you that I was skeptical, but I was just happy to see my grandpa again. He explained how, when the time is right, spirits can come back to the land of the living, and there is so much superstition and ritual going on during Halloween that the barrier between our worlds grew thin. He apologized for not visiting sooner, claiming that he had tried many times, but that he simply hadn't been experienced enough until this year, and we all believed him. Once all this was finished, we agreed it was best if we left my grandparents alone to catch up. Grandpa stood up, turned to my grandmother and reached out his hand. "I've got a lot to tell you. Come with me." He smiled as he said this, a warm, friendly smile. She took his hand and together they walked down the hall and out of sight. The rest of us went back downstairs, still shaken by what had occurred. We spent a long time in the silence there by the fire. Trick-or-treaters would still drop by, even more infrequently than before. Eventually we got back to talking and joking, almost as though there weren't a ghost upstairs. It was the best night we'd spent together in years. Mother was just telling us a story about Grandpa when he was our age when the doorbell rang again. It was now going on 11 o'clock, so we weren't expecting any more children. A cry of, "Trick or treat," came from outside the door though, so my mom stopped her story and went to the door. My mom loved children. She peeked out the front window and caught just a glimpse of the young girl standing there in the pink princess outfit. She swung the door open, not even waiting to get a full view of the girl before complimenting her costume. "Well, don't you just look adorable?" That was the sound of a bowl hitting the floor, and my mother froze mid-sentence. "What's wrong, Mommy?" The voice didn't come from any of us. It came from outside. My father, my older siblings and I all looked at each other before racing to the front door. When I got there, my heart leaped into my throat and tears filled my eyes. Standing in the doorway was my youngest sister, Sarah. Sarah, who had been killed in a car crash years earlier. Those of you who have shared a house with a young child can imagine how deeply their absence is felt. There is no aspect of life they don't affect in one way or another. And when she died, nothing was the same. And there she stood. Not a day older and not a mark on her body. I broke down, crying. When I looked around, I saw that all my family was crying. And Sarah looked deeply troubled by it. "Did I do something wrong, Mommy?" The voice snapped us all back to the moment. "Of course you didn't, sweetie," my mother replied hurriedly, adding, "We just missed you." "Can I come in now?" We let her in, of course. The family then talked as we hadn't talked in years. Sarah was just the same as she'd ever been. Back then I would have called her annoying, but that night she couldn't have annoyed me if she tried. Once we had been together for half an hour or so, Sarah looked toward my parents. "Mom? Dad? Can I show you something?" "Of course you can, honey." My mother breathed. She still had tears in her eyes. Sarah leapt off the couch. "Great! Come with me," she said, holding out both her hands for my mother and father to take. Suddenly I realized that Grandma was still upstairs and had no idea Sarah had come back, so I went upstairs to get her. When I got upstairs, I saw my grandfather coming out of the room quietly and shutting the door behind him. When I asked her where Grandma was, he told me she was resting. I asked if she could come downstairs, and he simply said that wouldn't be possible, before adding that she would have plenty of time to spend with Sarah. I was excited. Did this mean that they were staying with us? I asked my grandfather, and he just smiled and went downstairs with me. My older siblings were chatting in the living room when Sarah came skipping in from around the corner alone. "Where are Mom and Dad?" I asked. "Well, when we went down to the basement, they started kissing and hugging, and told me to go back upstairs, so I did." That didn't sound right. I couldn't imagine my mother leaving Sarah's side for a moment tonight. Nobody else seemed to find that strange, though. Grandma just laughed and said that adults were weird and that I'd understand someday. Then he turned to my brother and said he had brought a gift with him, something to make up for all the lost birthdays and Christmases. He held out his hand for my brother to take. "Come with me." It was only at this point that I grew suspicious. I asked Grandpa where my gift was, to which he simply said, "Oh, don't you worry. You'll get yours soon enough." I asked my brother not to go with him, but he didn't listen. Taking my grandfather's hand, the two of them went down the hall together. Sarah turned to us and said, "Mommy and Daddy have been down there a while. Let's go check on them." She reached out for us. "Come with me." My older sister reached for Sarah, but I slapped her hand away. "Billy, what? Don't go with her." I begged. "Come on, Meg," Sarah said. "Billy just don't want to see Mom and Dad kissing." Before I could stop her, Meg took Sarah's hand and the two of them went downstairs to the basement. Grandpa started coming back down the hall alone. His eyes met mine. "I've got your gift ready now, Billy. Come with me." I ran past him into my room and shut the door behind him. I didn't know what to do. I didn't have a cell phone yet and there was no home phones in my room. They hadn't been openly violent yet. But how long was that going to last? All I could do was just sit here and wait for them to either break in or leave. Heavy footsteps came down the hall and stopped just outside my door. My grandfather began calling me, begging me to come out so he could give me my present. A few minutes later, his voice was joined by Sarah's, asking me to come out and play with her. "Why don't you love me anymore, Billy? What did I do wrong?" She sounded like she was on the verge of tears. I can't possibly tell you how hard it was to stay in there, listening to my little sister beg me to play with her one last time. But the survival instinct is a strong one. I kept the door shut. The clock chimed 12 and it all fell silent. I looked under the door and my grandfather's figure was no longer casting a shadow underneath. I placed my ear to the door, listening carefully. I heard nothing. My family was out there, possibly hurt. I had to go check or call for help. Just do something at least. I took a deep breath to steady myself and opened the door. The hallway was empty. Across the hall through the open door I could see my brother lying on the ground, motionless. He was pale and it didn't look like he was breathing. I was only in high school, but I ran over to him. I checked his wrist and his neck for a pulse, but found nothing. All I saw was that one of his hands was tinged black, as if necrotic. I ran upstairs. I should have called the police or an ambulance or somebody, but my mind wasn't working. I found Grandma in the same state. Pale, not breathing, her hands slightly blackened. My heart was racing. I had to go to the basement. I couldn't go to the basement, because I knew what I would find there. The rest of my family laying pale and motionless dead. I sat there for a long time paralyzed before I decided that I had to know. The descent to the basement felt longer than I'd ever had before. I felt cold and numb, and each step felt like an eternity. But when I got to the bottom, I saw exactly what I knew I would find. My parents and my older sister all lying on the floor. I began to cry. Cry like I hadn't done in years. Like I hadn't since the day my little sister died. You stupid boy. The voice was sinister and evil, sounding just like every demon from every horror movie you've ever seen and worse. I spun around and Sarah was there, but she was different. Her eyes were empty sockets, and her mouth was a black lipless hole ringed with fangs. You have no more family, no more loved ones. They all came with me. They're mine now. And you will live the rest of your life alone. You will die somewhere, forgotten, alone, and afraid. You will never see your family again, ever. Then the thing paused and held out his hand. Unless, of course, you come with me. You can be with us all again. Forever. I'd like to tell you now that I kept my distance, that I told her to get out of my house, or at least that I sat frozen. But what she said was true. I felt it, deep in my bones. I would never see my family again if I didn't go with her. I was just a kid, a scared, stupid kid who wanted his mom. I stood shakily and reached out my hand slowly. Sarah's mouth formed a sick facsimile of a smile as I approached. There was a noise upstairs. The clock chimed 1 o'clock, and I looked up just for a heartbeat. There was a distant scream, and when I looked forward again, Sarah was gone. I called 911. It was eventually deemed that the family died of carbon monoxide poisoning, and that the leak had spontaneously resolved itself and dispersed through my grandmother's open window. My experiences were brought on by hysteria and oxygen deprivation. Could have been worse. They could have blamed me. I was legally an adult at that point, so the estate fell to me. I sold the house and everything in it and moved to a small apartment, using the proceeds to put myself through school once I graduated. If you see a loved one who has passed away this Halloween, please don't let them in. Don't take their hand and never ever go with them. You might be asking why I'm sharing this now. It's a fair question. For many years I've been terrified of the things that came to my house that night. For decades I thought that the scariest thing in the world was the idea that whatever came to visit, whatever we let into our home, they weren't my family. This year though, I had a thought that was even more disturbing still. What if they were? I wasn't supposed to be driving that night. Pat was our designated driver. But they forgot about halfway through the night and started drinking heavily. I, having nursed the same cocktail up until I saw them getting red in the face and wobbly, knew my limitations were over with then and there, and that their responsibility was now mine. I was annoyed, but since I hadn't intended on getting shit-faced that evening, I suppose Pat thought sobriety was wasted on them and figured I'd all but offered to take their place. In any case, once the night was done, I helped Pat and our friends, Cynthia and James, into the car and slipped into the driver's seat. Pat was mumbling something about what a great friend I was and got nothing but daggers from me in return. The other two was passed out before they even buckled up, forcing me to lean over them like a mother to secure them in place. Was I this bad when I drank? Another flash of annoyance hit me. They could all sleep soundly, leaving me alone having to stay alert and awake to play taxi for them. What's more, I wasn't so keen on driving specifically Pat home. See, there's this tunnel between their house and center town, and while it's just an ordinary tunnel, as far as everyone else is concerned, I can't stand it. It It makes my skin crawl because of something that happened when I was a kid. Honestly, it scares the shit out of me. I usually take a different route just so I can avoid it, but doing so adds an hour to the trip. And at 2 in the morning in a car that stank of crusted puke, I made the mistake of picking the tunnel. I want to be clear that when I said the tunnel scared me, I could never have predicted what happened that night. When I was a kid, my brother told me the tunnel was the mouth of a giant. The only way to survive was to hold my breath the whole way through. Stupid in hindsight, but kids believe in the weirdest superstitions. So, I held my breath until I couldn't. Until the world was almost nothing but darkness with a few small spots of light. And then, I let in the faintest of inhales and heard a shriek coming from the other end of the tunnel. I was convinced I'd made the giant aware of me, and now we were going to die. Can you imagine experiencing the genuine, honest-to-goodness fear of death at that age? Now, of course, since I'm writing this, I didn't die in the belly of a monster. Instead, I hyperventilated with my hands slapped over my mouth, bracing myself for the worst. Until we came upon a wreck. Someone had lost control of their vehicle and had driven right into the tunnel wall. That was the sound I'd heard. I didn't see a simple accident though. Through the lens of a child's imagination, I saw the twisted metal as a car gnashed by the teeth of a giant. I saw the accident as somehow being my fault, all because I took a breath. I never wanted to go through that tunnel again after that, and if I had to, I held my breath the entire time, just in case. As I got older, the fear morphed into avoidance of the tunnel, which leads us to this story, to me pulling up along the side of the road near the mouth of the tunnel, with my 3 friends passed out in the passenger seats. I think I was more anxious than scared. Something about the way the wind moved through the entrance put me on edge. I could hear the howl even with the windows rolled down. I figured I'd wait for another car to drive in fast. It felt a little silly, but you know what they say, safety in numbers. It wasn't long before a little Corolla passed me and was engulfed in the darkness. I hit the gas and followed behind, trying not to be too creepy about it. It was nice to see the taillights blazing the trail in front of me. I followed it to about the halfway point of the tunnel, to the point where I used to start struggling to hold my breath. I could feel myself unintentionally holding it now. So far it was going fine, and I even started to relax a little. It was the calm before the storm. Suddenly something weird happened. The car in front of us began to shrink, as though it had violently sped up. I accelerated to give chase, not wanting to lose its slide, but no matter how fast I went, the distance between us only grew. I couldn't hear the revving of its engine, and I couldn't understand why or how it was going so fast so quietly. It kept shrinking, illuminating what seemed like ever-encroaching tunnel walls. I would have stopped and turned around if I wasn't sure it was only an optical illusion. Likewise, I would have turned around if I'd realized I should have been long out of the tunnel by then. Sometimes you miss the forest for the trees, and that Corolla was my tree. By the time the Corolla became a blip on the horizon, I realized I was white-knuckling the steering wheel. I stopped focusing on my convoy partner, slowed and took in the surroundings. Where was the left lane? Gone, I realized. I was tucked between narrow tunnel walls with the roof so low if I'd been driving a van the top would have scraped against it. My first thought was that I'd somehow veered into a maintenance tunnel, and I was lucky I hadn't scratched Pat's car in the process. Then I noticed how dark it was. With the Corolla now completely out of view and no hanging lights, I could only see as far as my headlights shined. Everything beyond that was pitch black, like in the deepest recesses of the ocean. I wasn't sure how far into the maintenance tunnel I was, nor whether I'd loop back to rejoin the main road. I didn't have room to turn the car around, and the thought of backing up the whole way filled me with a potent sense of dread. I didn't want to not look forward. Something told me I needed to keep my eyes on the road ahead. What was safer, the road not traveled, or the road I could barely see because Pat cheaped out and didn't get LEDs for his taillights? I swallowed a knot of apprehension, imagining myself in the throat of the giant. I tried to open the door, but I found the wall so tight I only had room to squeeze out one foot. Had the tunnel gotten narrower? No, there was no way. I closed the door and decided to keep going. If nothing else, I hoped the tunnel would widen enough for me to turn at some point. But I took it slow, the tires crackling beneath me. There was movement in my peripheral vision, and my eyes shut to the side view mirror, where I could have sworn I saw the concrete buckle behind me. I gripped my teeth and tried to shove Pat awake to no avail. I could feel my skin, every inch of it. It's like I was suddenly hyper-aware of myself. It itched. Blood rushed over my head, and I swear I could feel my eyeballs move. I needed to expand. I needed to get out of the oppressive closeness. The walls were getting tighter. My throat was getting tighter. Breathing was getting harder. Was it my imagination? I smacked Pat in desperation, and although I wanted to try Cynthia and James, I couldn't bring myself to look in the back seat. I don't know why, but something in my gut told me if I turned around, I'd find a concrete wall encasing me in the front. I don't know whether I was stubborn or stupid not to turn around. I don't know if it was false hope or logic or fear. I have no idea what compelled me to keep going, even as I began to hear the scraping of metal on concrete, even as my nails struck into the steering wheel and splintered, even as I grit my teeth, trying to will the tunnel to release me. That's when I heard a slap. It was strong. Wham! Against Pat's door. When I dared to look, the blood drained from my face. There was something in the wall. Something coming out of the wall, more like. Rocky fingers attached to palms, squeezing against the glass. The wall rippled like a wave and the hands eroded, giving chase. I sped up, not knowing whether I was being led like a lamb to the slaughter or closer to my salvation. The hands kept pace, following me at 80 kilometers an hour, like it was nothing. The walls were getting tighter. I was entombed in darkness. The walls were moving, solid but malleable, soft like liquid concrete, but when they hit the car, sparks flew. I realized I was screaming. I pushed down on the accelerator, testing the speed of the car. The hands followed. More hands. I could see them in the rearview mirror and the side mirrors in front of me. They were everywhere, scratching and tapping at the car, trying to get in. I was still screaming so loud my throat turned to sandpaper. Faces began to pull away from the walls, mouths and eyes and noses stretching out like shapes pushed through fabric. I couldn't tell whether I was still screaming or if the yells I'd heard were coming out of these concrete mouths. I just knew I needed to keep going. I needed to reach safety. I couldn't let them catch us. Catch me. Suddenly I heard the familiar click of the door handle being pulled. Pat's door. In any other context, the sound wouldn't be so heart-stopping terrifying. In this one, it pushed me beyond the edge, in a place so deep into the wall of horror that I became almost numb. My nervous system couldn't handle that sensory and panic overload. I think it's resignation. I think the realm beyond fear is a kind of acceptance to your fate, to your inevitable death. It's a kindness your body offers you in the last moments of your life, so that an imprint of your fear isn't left behind when your soul leaves your body. Or maybe it's for your loved ones, so they can see you died peacefully and can move on easier than if you kick the bucket in the wild thrashes of agonizing fear, begging for help and sobbing. Point being, when the door began to jostle open, I felt this wave of near calm and closed my eyes to let it happen. I took my hands off the steering wheel and slowly released the gas pedal. And then there was silence. There was no longer the grinding sound of metal on concrete. No screaming. No tapping or scraping or anything else like that. I opened my eyes in time to see the car portering out the tunnel finally, with the night sky blissfully far away and the tree line giving me a very wide berth. The false calm turned into relief. The relief soured into fear as I thought about what had just happened, and it all sank in. You hear stories of injured people capable of incredible feats to save themselves, and the moment they reach safety, they collapse. That was me, essentially. I drove the car a bit further down the road and pulled off to the side. The stress had me shaking violently, and I could barely get my legs out of the car. I fell on all fours. I must have looked like a drunk. As I reeled on the grass, I could hear Cynthia and James waking up and asking questions from the back seat. Trivial. Why are we stopped? Or, where are we? I couldn't care less what they were saying. Now I know what you're thinking. The second I closed my eyes and accepted my fate, I was freed from the tunnel. It must have been all a bad dream or some weird allegory for dealing with my childhood fear. You would be wrong. The car was scraped to all hell. There were dents in the metal, shaped like large hands. And then there was Pat. Pat, the designated driver who got drunk and forced me to take their place that night. Pat, my friend since grade school. Pat, who for the duration of the tunnel had been unresponsive to my screams and shakes and pleas to wake up. Pat, who was dead. their face twisted in abject horror, as though they woke up just in time to see death coming for them. Pat, who hadn't had time to go through the stages of fear and reach the bliss before the end. The reason I now believe that the peace is more for everyone else's sake than one's own. Because now I know they died screaming. I know exactly what they felt like in those final moments. Because I'd felt every rung from that ladder of fear. But I had survived to tell the tale. Ultimately, Pat's death was ruled as a heart attack. Officials think I fell asleep at the wheel, causing the car to veer into the wall before regaining control. Which makes no sense. The scratches were on all surfaces of the car, even the undercarriage. But I suppose they were looking for an explanation, whether true or false. As for the tunnel, I don't intend to ever drive through it ever again. But from my research, I know one thing I didn't know when it happened. There is no maintenance tunnel. There's just a main road. Which means the only mistake I made that night was ever driving into the mouth of the beast in the first place. For a number of years, I was a camp counselor at an overnight camp in the Muskokas. I loved it more than any job I ever had. Despite the non-existing pay, annoying campers, long days and short nights, crappy food, etc. For one, I got to tell as many scary stories as I could sputter out. There was nothing better than hanging around a dying campfire with a bunch of junior high kids who were demanding the scariest, most blood-curdling tales I knew. And I told them all. The babysitter and the eerie clown statue, the driver and the creepy gas attendant, the woman and her licking dog. I saved my best stories for the overnight trips we made in Algonquin Park. For non-Canadians, it's a massive park in the middle of Ontario, spanning nearly 8,000 square kilometers. When days would be spent canoeing on pristine lakes and nights would be spent around the fire, singing and making s'mores, and being as rowdy as the only people within miles could be. Once the kids had quieted down, I told them stories of a stalker in the woods, with a face so horrifying it paralyzed all of its victims in fear. Or the group of campers who decided to spend the night across the lake from an abandoned, or was it, insane asylum. On this particular night, I'd finished up the tales, once again insisting that they were entirely true, and sent the campers to their tents. It had been an exhausting day and none of the 6 kids were in any mood to stay up later. My fellow counselor had also decided to pack it in, leaving just me on a fallen log next to the dying fire. I took a deep breath of the cool, fresh pine scented air and looked out at the lake. The partial moon reflected off the glassy water, and on the other side I could see towering cliffs going up several hundred feet. I considered whether we could canoe over, climb up a few dozen feet and do some cliff jumping. I grinned. The camp director would have my head if we did that. If he found out. Movement at the very top of the cliffs caught my eye. There was a small light bobbing along the peak. At first I thought it was a star, but it was larger and gave off a golden glow. It slowly moved back and forth in a small arc. As I sat up and watched it, another appeared next to it, bobbing along the top of the cliff. Then another, and another, a few more. My stomach dropped into my feet. I grabbed my bag and pulled my digital camera out and focused it on the little glowing orbs and used the zoom function. I counted them and then I counted again. Oh shit. In a flash I was up and running to the tents. Hey guys, wake up, we gotta go. There was movement in the tents and then I had 7 confused heads looking out at me. My co-counselor wore a mixture of concern and pure anger. I hate to do this, I continued. But the clouds are looking really threatening. There's a big rainstorm coming in. If we get caught in it, it's going to ruin our trip. Seriously? Laura, my co-counselor, asked. We're in the middle of the woods. Where would we go? I pulled a map and flashlight out of my bag. There's a ranger station a few kilometers south of us. I traced the path with my finger. Thank God. We can make it there in a few hours. The campers groaned. Can't we just go in the morning? No, I shouted, my voice echoing across the lake. I lowered it. Come on, let's get packed on up and go. I'll tell you a story along the way. I smiled, though I could feel my lips quivering. It's my best one? That seemed to get them going. And within 10 minutes the tents were packed up and we'd begun our trek into the deep woods, with small flashlights as our only guide. When I was confident we were moving at a steady pace, I allowed myself to relax and began to tell my favorite campfire story. Centuries before the European settlers made their way into the country, it was inhabited by the First Nations people. They had made the trip from across western Canada, following the migration patterns of large animals, such as buffalo and bison. Eventually, they reached Ontario, at which point they split off into smaller groups of travelers, each searching for a section of land to call their own. Legend has it that one group, consisting of about 20 men, women, and children, had ventured through this very area in search of a place to call home. Though it wasn't even the end of October, the weather had made a turn for the worse, and as the group journeyed around the lake, a fierce blizzard hit. Within an hour, the group found themselves in blinding snow and below zero temperatures. The clothes they had on them were made for the fall, not this sort of weather, and there weren't any Canada Goose jackets around back then. But they pressed on. They didn't have any other choice. Night was falling as they reached a cliff bluff, which towered over a cold, choppy lake. There was no stopping for this group. They'd die if they didn't make it past the cliffs. But with darkness setting in and the snow falling even harder, visibility was almost non-existent. So one of the elders had an idea. Using the little kerosene they had left, he lit a lantern for each of the travelers and had them carry it in front of them. Not so that they could see the cliffs, but so they could see who was in front of them, allowing them to all follow each other across the narrow bluffs. With the strongest of the men leading the way, the group began to cross the cliffs. The freezing, wet snow soaked every bone in their body. The harsh wind chilled any exposed skin and threatened to push them right off the rock. Their path was no more than a few feet wide, and would have been slippery to even the best of hiking boots, let alone hand-fashioned moccasins. Slowly, painstakingly slowly, they made their way up the cliffs, praying that whatever lay on the other side could shelter them from the intensifying storm. They were about halfway up, hundreds of feet above the lake, though it was well out of their vision. In fact, all they could see in this blinding snow was the lantern in front of them, acting as a beacon to guide their steps. If the light moved up, they moved up. If it went down, they moved down. Each of the travelers was almost in a trance, caring about nothing but the glowing orb a few feet away. For the leader, though, there was no such luxury. He moved forward blindly, feeling along the cliff with his free arm, though his skin was so numb he could barely feel anything. As the path wound back again, he made a misstep and lost his footing, just as a gust of wind blasted his back. He desperately grasped the hold, but his frozen fingers couldn't get anything. With a terrified scream, he slipped off the cliffs and fell into the icy black lake. The rest of the party didn't see him fall, of course. All they saw was his glowing orb dropping away from the bluff and disappearing in the darkness. There was no time to mourn. They continued on, but the storm was worsening. After another minute, one of the children, his body unable to withstand the cold, dropped away, his lantern glowing until the choppy waters put it out. Another, having seen this, lost his balance and fell. This pattern went on until there was just 5 people left, fumbling along in the darkness, following the light in front. As hard as they tried, the cliffs were unforgiving. The remaining men fell down to 4, then 3, then 2. And then there was just one left, who legend says cursed the earth as his legs slipped and he plunged hundreds of feet down, his lantern the last one to be extinguished. Of the 20 members who tried to overcome the cliffs, I finished. Not one of them survived. They say that sometimes when the conditions are right, you can see the orbs along the cliff, symbols of the lost travelers who will never find their homes. As the story ended, leaving the campers in an eerie silence, I saw lights up ahead. A wave of relief poured over me. We picked up the pace and found the ranger station bursting with activity, with a half a dozen people running around, loading up trucks and shouting into radios. The wind was beginning to really pick up, and I heard thunder in the distance. "Hey, you kids!" A large, burly man with a full beard and mustache ran up to us. "Get in the trucks, we don't have much time." Laura and I led the kids to one of the pickup trucks. "What's going on?" I asked the man. "Didn't you hear?" Another gust of wind. "Huge storm systems heading right for us. Already been tornadoes touched down. We're getting everyone out of here. Let's go." We all climbed into the trunk's bed. I collapsed down, feeling like I'd just been punched in the gut. The ranger climbed into the front and we took off down a makeshift road. My head was spinning. It wasn't possible. How? Laura slid next to me, keeping her voice low. How did you know we had to get out of there? I looked over at her. My face felt empty of any blood. I saw the lights. What? No, no! She gasped, then caught herself. How many? I took a deep breath. 8. She looked around at all the campers, who were now lying against each other, asleep despite the bumpy road. That's all of us. My God. I nodded and leaned against her. Laura had heard the traveler's stories before, and she knew that I left out a key bit of information. The lights were real, but they were never random. If they were shining, bobbing back and forth, swinging in a small arc, it was because they had a message, a warning. One light would shine for each person who was about to die. We all have that one friend who's not into the holidays. You know the one. Won't decorate, won't dress up, and won't wish you a happy whatever day it is. And though he'll reluctantly agree to come to your theme party, he'll stay in the back and scowl the whole time. In most cases, the hate is directed at just one holiday, whether it be Valentine's, Christmas, Easter, or hell, even Arbor Day. My friend Patrick, he hated Halloween. With every fiber of his being. Now, Patrick hadn't always been that way. I'd known him since grade school, and we'd usually spend Halloween together. I noticed a sudden shift in his attitude around the time we got too old to go trick-or-treating, but too young to go out drinking. At first I figured he was just being a normal, angsty teenager. Maybe he thought Halloween was just for babies. Maybe he was pissed off about not being allowed to go trick-or-treating anymore. Or maybe it was just a phase. Damned if I knew. It wasn't until last year that I found out the real reason. It was a few days before Halloween, and I'd managed to drag Patrick to a costume party. Naturally, he'd shown up in his usual t-shirt and jeans and told the doorman he was dressed as a broke college student. He was in that state of semi-drunkenness where he'd started slurring his words, but was still mostly coherent. Some chick were wearing devil horns, and almost nothing else, ran into him, and I saw him flinch when he looked at her. He mumbled about how much he hated Halloween, and I finally got around to asking him why. That's when his face drained of color, as though he hadn't had years to prepare his answer. He emptied his cup and shuffled nervously from foot to foot. His story started with a promising, "You're not going to believe this," but when Patrick was 14, his parents left him alone on Halloween night. Nothing unusual there, he was more than old enough to take care of himself. They left him with a bag of candy and put him in charge of handing it out to the neighborhood kids, but were adamant that he stop by 10 p.m., lock the doors and turn off the porch lights. 10 p.m., they insisted, and not a minute later. There were enough kids that night that Patrick had to spend the first half of the evening sitting outside on the porch, handing out candy to the seemingly endless procession of kids. Around 8:30 p.m., things quieted down enough for him to head inside, make some popcorn and start watching a horror movie. He had to pause every few minutes to cater to another cluster of kids. But as the evening wore on, the visits came fewer and farther between, until he only had to get up every 10 minutes or so. He hadn't heard a peep for a good 20 minutes when he noticed a figure making his way up the driveway. Patrick rolled off the couch and checked the time. 10:08 p.m. Most kids had gone home already and were busy sorting out their candy. However, Patrick knew from experience that houses tended to give out more treats near the end of the night, just so they could get rid of the surplus and close up shop. He figured this kid was trying his luck, hoping for a jackpot. It was too late to turn off the lights and pretend he wasn't home, so Patrick decided he'd give this kid the jackpot he deserved, and would go dark as soon as he left. The figure rounded the corner as Patrick headed to the door. By the time he'd armed himself with a handful of candy and opened the door, the figure had reached the foot of his stairs. He realized then that the person just outside of the beams of his porch light was much taller than a child. A parent, he figured. Maybe his kid had fallen asleep or was hiding under the thick black cloak he was wearing. The man's costume was strange. The fabric looked to be much higher quality than anything you could buy at the store, that's for sure. It was a thick, tattered cloak covered in chains that jangled with every movement. Two black horns protruded from the top of the hood, leaving frilled frayed fabric all around the holes they'd torn.
Trick or treat, trick or treat. Give me something good to eat.
It bellowed. The voice was so unnatural that it sent a chill down Patrick's spine. He swore to me that it sounded like two people had spoken in unison. The figure took another step up the stairs, which brought them within the radius of the porch light. Patrick could now see that he was wearing a goat's mask beneath his hood. Two pearly yellow eyes with slit pupils stared at him. He stared back. The mask was so lifelike. Its fur swayed softly in the breeze. Mist seemed to escape its wet nostrils, and the eyes looked real, almost as though they'd been ripped right off an animal and glued on while they were still fresh. And suddenly the goat's eyes blinked. On instinct, Patrick slammed the door shut and locked it. He could hear the patter of something thick as the figure climbed up the wooden steps. Patrick looked out the peephole hesitantly, hoping he was wrong, praying the man would take his mask off and start laughing at him.
Trick or treat, trick or treat. Give me something good to eat.
It said. Patrick watched as a long forked tongue slithered out of its maw and licked its lips with feverish hunger. He strained his vision enough to notice hoofed feet clicking against the floor. Suddenly it rammed into the door with all its might, over and over again. Patrick didn't know what else to do, but to press himself against the door in the hopes of keeping it shut, and turning off the porch lights in a vain attempt at pretending he wasn't home. As soon as the light went off, the creature ceased its offense on the door. The clattering of its footsteps slowly moved towards the living room window. In a panic, Patrick darted into the living room and drew the curtains shut. As he did so, he noticed every other house on the street had already turned off their lights. He ran through the first floor and turned off all the lights he could find, and then ducked behind the couch and hid. Thankfully, the sounds of rattling chains and hooves stopped. Patrick studied me as he told his story, almost as though trying to gauge whether or not I believed him. I didn't know what to say. It wasn't like him to spin yarns, but there was no way his story was true. It was probably just some dude in a really good costume trying to freak you out. Mission accomplished, I reassured. Patrick shook his head and told me his story wasn't done. He continued. It hadn't been very hard for him to convince himself the whole thing had been in his head. He figured he had a sugar crash and dozed off mid-movie. It was all just a nightmare, nothing more. That is, until a year later, when Halloween rolled back around. He was home alone again. Sort of. He snuck his girlfriend in as soon as his parents' car disappeared down the street. He and his girlfriend left a bowl of candy on the porch and shut the curtains so they could canoodle in peace. Throughout the night, between the shrill screams of bimbos getting mutilated on TV, they heard kids running up and down the front steps to grab Halloween candy. Again, as the night progressed, fewer and fewer kids showed up, until the trick-or-treaters trickled to a stop. Neither Patrick nor his girlfriend thought to turn off the porch light when 10 p.m. ticked by. Before long, they heard the clunk of something heavy on the porch, followed by a strong knock at the door. Not noticing the time and thinking the bowl of candy needed to be filled, Patrick walked over and opened the door at a crack. He saw a yellow eye with a rectangular pupil that darted from side to side until it fixed on him.
Trick or treat, trick or treat. Give me something good to eat.
It said as a hoofed foot kicked at the door. Patrick screamed and slammed into the door in an attempt to shut it. But the goat-headed stranger was putting all its weight against it. It was a tug of war, or rather a push of war, with the goat trying to open the door and Patrick trying to shut it. Beads of sweat rolled down his face as Patrick yelled at his girlfriend to help. Together they managed to push it far enough to lock the deadbolt, but even then the goat outside rammed against the door repeatedly. It looked as though it was going to fall off its hinges. Patrick's girlfriend was screaming. She hadn't seen what was on the other side of the door, but she knew it was trouble. "Hit the lights!" yelled Patrick, as he desperately pressed himself against the door. She flicked them shut and suddenly everything went quiet. They waited in the dark for a while, neither one daring to look out the door or pull open the curtains to see if the thing was still outside. It wasn't until they heard the crackling of a car up the gravel driveway that the two finally relaxed. I stared at Patrick this time in clear disbelief. It sounded like horseshit to me. Or I guess you could say goat shit. "Every year," he said, his tone dull and his gaze distant. "It comes every year. If I have so much as one light on, no matter where I am. My parents' house, their girlfriends, it doesn't matter. he finds me. I let out a chuckle and pat him on the back. I played it off as a joke, fully expecting him to crack a smile and tell me he was pulling my leg. He didn't. I changed the subject and brought him a drink. Halloween came and went, and I forgot all about his story. Which brings us to this Halloween. I was hosting a party at my place. I'd invited Patrick, but he refused, as usual. Suddenly, a few minutes past 10 p.m., my phone rang. It was Patrick. I picked up and said hello, but all I could hear was his sobs and the sound of violent banging on wood. Imagine the sound of your pissed-off landlord knocking on your door demanding payment, multiplied by 20. Patrick's mumbles were nearly indecipherable through his choked cries.
The lights won't.
He kept saying. I didn't understand what he meant.
The lights!
He screamed. I heard what I thought was his door splintering open. There was a loud slam and the sound of jangling chains. Patrick screamed a scream so feral that I felt my body seize up. And then I heard it. I heard the most chilling voice I've ever heard in my life. A voice so cold it ran daggers through my veins. A voice that reverberated through my speaker and seemed to have not one, but two sources. I don't mean there was an echo. It sounded like a man, but with a normal voice. But with that normal voice came one that was deeper, produced an unholy growl with every syllable.
Trick or treat. Give me something good to eat.
It uttered. I heard something being dragged. Patrick's screams and the sounds of jangling became distant, until I couldn't hear them anymore. I left my party and sped across town to Patrick's condo. All I found was his phone on the welcome mat, his door hanging over its hinges, and a dozen solar lights he'd installed in his flower bed this past summer. If you're still watching, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I know I've been away for a while, kind of like in a hiatus of sort. There's been a lot going on in my life, and frankly, I've just not really been able to create the videos I wanted. I guess I have a certain standard I want to live up to, and I really didn't want to like work on videos if I couldn't like get to that standard. So yeah, that's basically why I've been away and just a lot going on. I've really missed making videos and interacting with you guys, and hopefully you're still here and you're enjoying my content. Either way, thank you so much for watching, and there will be more consistent uploads from here on out. Hopefully. It should be fine. I just need to get back in the rhythm so I can make some more consistent content for you guys. Anyways, I should stop this rambling now. I just really wanted to like update you guys to where I've been. But yeah, I'm really excited to get like back into it and give you guys some more consistent stories. Let me know what you think about this video down below. And make sure to check out Noetic on YouTube. I'll put her link down below. And I'd love if you left a like. And apparently there's some kind of hype thing too. So by all means do that if you feel like it. And subscribe for more stories. Thank you so much for watching and have a great day.